Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Some of you may have heard that a small group of Nazis in the Midwest planned a day of hate in February. They called for other white supremacist groups to be part of this supposed day of hate and target Jewish houses of worship and institutions. It received quite a bit of press, probably more than it deserved. As the authorities suspected, nothing came of it. But it reminds us all that exposing hate and acknowledging the history of all forms of oppression and prejudice is the first step to combating anti-Semitism, racism, and all forms of hatred, and that the work is unfortunately ongoing. Furthermore, in order to prevent and combat this evil, we need the emotional, physical, and spiritual support of a greater community. When we raise our voices together, we are much stronger and harder to ignore. This is why I'm so pleased that we are engaging in this exploration together. Tonight we have the second forum in the series on the history of Christian antisemitism. This two-part dialogue is the first in a new interfaith venture entitled Come Let Us Reason Together, Jewish-Christian Conversations, sponsored by the First Congregational Church, Israel Congregation, along with the support of the Interfaith Council of the North Shire. The plan is to continue with many more opportunities for education, connection, and dialogue. I am so grateful to my two dear friends and colleagues, Reverend Bill Borror and Rabbi Michael Cohen, for their presence and participation here tonight and last month at First Congregational Church. Perhaps the most important message for all of us as we grapple with an increase in anti-Semitic activity and racism in our country and around the world, that we can't do this alone. We need to be there for each other in community. We need to be allies in the struggle. We must call out hatred and forge alliances to fight it wherever it rears its ugly head, no matter what group is targeted. And when the unthinkable happens, we must reach out with our innate capacity for compassion to comfort those who are suffering and make sure they know that they are not alone. It makes a world of difference. Again, welcome. Thank you for being here tonight and for joining us on Zoom. Several people are on Zoom with us. We are now privileged to be guided through this history with Reverend Bill Borror.
Well, for those of you who felt overwhelmed at the last meeting when we did 1,500 years, the good news, we're not doing 1,500 years. We're doing 600 years today. All right, we'll come back in a minute here. And I also invited Michael to jump in, and he'll have his time at the end. But I think there's an opportunity for us to kind of talk about some things here, because it's really at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a general feeling that the worst was way behind us in this issue, and the 20th century was worse than all the other centuries combined. Okay, so, and what's happening now makes sense if you know the story. So, part two of the story. So this is just this week. Scott already mentioned it. This is from the ADL tracker. If you are on Twitter, if you're on Twitter, may God have mercy on your soul. But at any rate, I thought this is what struck me. Despite concerns over increased anti-Semitic activity, matter of fact, our daughters was going to a fraternity party they had canceled at Muhlenberg because of fear of this, right? This large Jewish student body at Muhlenberg. But this is what is, in spite of anti-Semitic activity, 225 has so far been a pretty typical Saturday in America, with white supremacist protests in Florida and Georgia, anti-Semitic propaganda in Texas, California, Florida, and Arizona, and white supremacists monetizing their hate-filled online live streams. That was typical. It's a typical day in America. I don't know if you saw this today, but there was a Michigan man allegedly threatened on social media to kill all the Jewish members of the Michigan government, including the Attorney General. All right, that's today. Okay, this week. All right, let's talk about how did Judaism become anti-Semitism? Anti-Judaism become anti-Semitism? I lost with that question at the last gathering, and I think it's, in some levels, it is the question of the modern period, right? And were you the one that, when you asked me what the modern period was today, and I said starting with the Renaissance, you looked at me like I was insane. Was that you? Okay. But part of the problem is the hope of modernity has kind of petered out into post-modernity, and that's part of why we need to understand why there's no longer this monolith Christendom that has this bias against Judaism. Then why are we where we're at today? And why did basically a pagan ideology, kill 6 million Jews? Okay? All right, so that's part of what we're going to look at today. Now, from the Renaissance into the Enlightenment, this may not seem like much remarkable to you, but it is a Renaissance portrait of a Jewish man looking at a Hebrew text. And it's the first such example of this that we have. So it demonstrates something was changing in the Renaissance. And part of that change was this interest in antiquity. Okay, the Renaissance wasn't really so much about new stuff as rediscovering really good old stuff and bringing it back. And of course, part of that was about text and getting the best, most accurate text of not only the wisdom of antiquity, but most particularly on getting the best translations of the Bible. And if you're going to do that, you need to learn Hebrew. So at the same time, there was this Johannes Reuchlin. Anybody, if you're Lutheran, that he is the great uncle of Philip Melanchthon. And there was attempts by the Inquisition, particularly in the Holy Roman Empire in the German states, to burn Jewish text. And he wrote a pamphlet about 40 years before the Reformation, or more like 20 years before the Reformation, arguing why you should not be destroying the text, the holy text of Jewish people. He was fluent in Hebrew, and that was part of the Renaissance was a new engagement with the Hebrew Bible. Christian scholars began learning Hebrew. Two, I think, particular important religious trends that we don't see the full fruit of these things until after the Holocaust, but the Council of Trent, this was the Counter-Reformation. In essence, I won't read it to you, but the Council of Trent in 1566, and this is part of their catechism. So this is what all Catholic children were to learn, and people who were getting prepared to be baptized, or not baptized, but for communion, that the guilt of the crucifixion should not be blamed on the Jews. Matter of fact, it goes on to say, we who profess to know him, yet deny him by our actions, are more guilty of the crucifixion of Christ than the Jews. Matter of fact, he says, according to the apostle, Jews are not as guilty, or not guilty of it because they were ignorant, according to Paul. Now, that may seem like not a big theological move, but that's a huge theological move. Basically, that's a repudiation of all the Christ-killing, God-killing hysteria of the Middle Ages, and it actually going back to the 2nd century. So that will lay the foundation for really important things. Unfortunately, it'll take 400 years and 6 million deaths for the full fruit of this to be found. A similar move that's important in the Protestant of things. The last time we looked at Luther's horrible diatribes against the Jewish people that will be used by the Nazis. But I won't go into the details of this, but John Calvin and the Calvinists, so that would include if you're a Calvinist in Germany, you were the German Reformed. If you're a Calvinist in Scotland, you're the Presbyterian. If you're a Calvinist in the Netherlands, you're a Dutch Reformed person. If you're a Calvinist that was terribly unhappy with the Church of England, you came to Vermont and started First Congregational Church, all right? Okay. I left out a few parts, but that's basically. So this idea of instead of the New Testament superseding the Old Testament. John Calvin and the Reformed tradition talked about there being one covenant. And so there's a continuity. Okay, there's one people of God. Okay, now that's if you would opens a different kind of way of thinking. Now there's implications for that aren't all good, but it's a shift. It's a shift. It's part of the reason, for instance, those of us who were educated in Reformed seminaries, we all were required to learn Hebrew. Okay, but that's an important idea that will have implications down the road. Okay. Now, the religious wars of the 16th and 17th century had a devastating effect on Europe. The top here is St. Bartholomew's Massacre. The French Huguenots died. Down here are some Protestants being burned at the stake, and it's a small map, but that's the 30-Year War. And part of what the impetus of the Enlightenment, there were other things that would have happened that caused the Enlightenment, but people said we have to come to a new way of understanding that's not based on sectarian Christianity. It wasn't a problem when there was just one Christianity in the West. But with the Reformation, there was sectarian Christianity. And so it was part of what brought about what becomes known as the Enlightenment. Reason over creed. That's Descartes up at the top. Doubt is the origin of wisdom. And John Locke. I find every sect, as far as reason will help them, make use of it gladly, and where it fails them, they cry out. It is a matter of faith and above reason. In other words, it's reason until we're right and you're wrong, right? And John Locke considered himself a very spiritual man. He actually, he and Sir Isaac Newton also were very religious people. But it was a different kind of Christianity that emphasized reason. And that I thought that's the way that we can move forward as a civilization. If we emphasize what brings us together. And of course, this is the beginning of a great optimism about what human progress and mind can do. And part of the result of both the Enlightenment and also the persecutions of the religious wars was there were pockets of tolerance. For instance, the Netherlands. Part of the reason the Netherlands was a place of tolerance for Jews who particularly had to flee Portugal, who were expelled from Portugal and Spain, was because the Dutch Christians themselves had been brutally persecuted in the Counter-Reformation. And thousands of Dutch Protestants had died at the hands of the Spanish particularly. And so this is the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam. This drawing and this painting is from 1688. You see a flourishing religious community in Amsterdam. There are also pockets of France, in part because of the Huguenots had been so persecuted, were also places of tolerance. And of course, one of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment was an excommunicated Jew, Baruch Spinoza. The highest activity a human being can attain is learning for understanding, because to understand is to be free. Okay? Here's just some shots of Enlightenment religion. Religion is the recognition of all our duties as divine commands. Religion is excellent stuff for keeping common people quiet. That's the Bonaparte. Religion and morality are essential pillars of a civil society. George Washington. Moses Mendelssohn, one of the first great religious philosophers, Jewish philosophers of the Enlightenment. By the way, the grandfather of Felix Mendelssohn, who was a Christian convert, but a great musician. My religion recognizes no obligations to resolve doubt other than through rational means and commands no mere faith in eternal truths. Okay? So what you have with this kind of Enlightenment period is a move towards a certain kind of degree, at least theoretically, of religious tolerance. Okay? Reasonable people, God is kind of moved over to a certain particular territory. Okay? He's given us our minds, so we'll use our minds, and he's still over there. Religion's important to help us behave ourselves. Ethics, right? Religion equals ethics. And that's That's why Kierkegaard lost his mind, right? And the first great critique of that, right? But nonetheless, that's what the Enlightenment sets up. Okay? And so for the Jewish, this period of Enlightenment ushers in a period of emancipation, but also the rise of modern anti-Semitism. So, any questions or comments at this point? Two important parts of the integration, assimilation, but also marginalization of Jews in Europe. First here, there's this wonderful schmaltzy picture of Napoleon granting Jews citizenship. Okay? And you also have, on the same hand, Voltaire, of course, who preceded him, says the Jews are an ignorant and barbarous people who have long united the most sordid of avarice with the most detestable superstition and the most invincible hatred for every people by whom they are tolerated and enriched. Now, Voltaire had some pretty rough things to say about Christianity, right? But his the hate in his rhetoric towards Judaism, again, father of liberalism here in many ways, father of enlightened thinking, the great intellectual champion of the French Revolution, says as nasty things as Martin Luther does. Okay. Now, the thing about the Napoleon, and this is these are all talks in themselves, but the official offer that Napoleon made to the Jewish people is that they were to see themselves as Frenchmen of Mosaic persuasion. That's the actual language. Okay? And that basically becomes the model of how Jewish people are invited into European society. Okay? Now, it took the last law restricting Jews in France was not passed until 40 years later. I think there were still laws on the book into the 1840s that restricted Jewish rights. But the basic ideas behind this, and frankly, this has been the deal that has been made in the West in many ways, including the United States. Okay? I didn't. I'm looking, so, all right, American flag and a Jewish flag. Okay? But we have the same, although Christians made up a flag. There is no such thing as a Christian flag. I think they just made it up so there could be balance up front, right? I'm not sure there should be any flags anyway. But anyway, that's a whole other thing to get me in trouble. But the deal was, okay, you can practice the Mosaic religion. By the way, and I'm about to skate out here on ice, but there's no ancient word for religion in Hebrew. It's a modern, the word for religion is a modern word because it wasn't a religion. It was the way, right? And so you can practice your Judaism as long as you're a good Frenchman or a good Dutchman, or that the Pledge of Allegiance is as important. That's the deal. And that's actually the deal of even the idea of separation from church and state was an attempt not to defend religion, but to keep, Madison and Jefferson were not big fans of clergy. And it was in part to keep religion at a distance. Okay? Now, I think the Baptists were for it for different reasons. Any of you are Baptists. The Baptists were go Jefferson, go Madison, because the Baptists were always losing in this country. But that's all part of this modern deal. Religion has a space. It's mostly a private space or for ethics. But really the center of your understanding of who you are you a Frenchman? Okay? Are you a citizen of the empire? Are you an American? Okay. Any questions about that? So accommodation. Rabbi Abraham Geiger, founder of the Reform movement, okay, which was a embracing, not very similar. I mean, those of us who are mainline Protestants, very similar project, okay? An embracing of Enlightenment principles, but also integrating that into a framework of Judaism, okay? And that, it happened a little later in this country, but that was the Reform movement. Now, Heinrich Heine, the great poet and writer. He represents one of thousands of intellectuals and artists who can just convert it to Christianity. It was just easier to convert. If you look at the role of Jewish converts to Christianity in the 19th century, it's a who's who of scholars, writers, musicians. Gustav Mahler. Okay, those among others. So that was now. Obviously, we find out we're not going to talk about that wasn't good enough for the Nazis, right? But at any rate, that's what happened. I don't know if you know this or not, but again, a lot of what underpins a lot of 20th and 21st century liberalism are Marxist ideas, and that, to me, is not in and of itself a dirty word. But Marx, whose family converted, he was a Jew, he was born Jewish into a Jewish family that converted. This is the philosophical underpinning of the Soviets and of the 20th century. What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is the worldly god of money? What is his worldly god? Money. I won't go through all the stuff here. But at the end he says, in the final analysis, the emancipation of the Jews is the emancipation of mankind from Judaism. Now you say similar things about Christianity, but his rhetoric on the Jewish question, okay, is basically, okay, Judaism has to go away and be merged into what will eventually become Marxist thought, right? All right. Again, so why are these wonderful places of learning? Why is there so much anti-Semitism in our universities? Okay, I kind of understand the neo-Nazis in Iowa, but what's happening at Stanford? Why is what's going on at Stanford going on? Or why, or Princeton or Harvard? Okay. All right. Now, you take away something has to fill the vacuum. Okay, and all of the hopeful ideas of the philosophers that humanity would evolve into this wonderful kind of synthesis, that didn't quite work out. And so what filled the vacuum? Nationalism, okay? All right, this is a cartoon being anti-nationalism from the 1880s. I think it might be a Dutch newspaper. But nationalism is kind of an artificial made-up thing, right? Okay, if you know anything about the ethnic heritage of Europe, for instance, okay, it was just one. If your ancestors were just running from one person to the other, intermarrying with whoever they bumped into. That's the ethnic heritage of Europe. Okay, right? All right. I always tell the story. My sister did one of those genetic things. I always tell people, we're all from Africa. I'll save your money. We all came from Africa, right? Okay. Up through the Rift Valley. There it is. All right. But my sister, we're part Irish or half Irish. And my sister goes, I did this, and we have Viking blood. We have Norwegian blood. We have, and I said, how did that happen? I go, just read a history book, okay? Our people were the playthings of the Vikings for 200 years, all right? So we all have a little Viking blood in us there. But so this idea of nationalism is an artificial construct, but it's filling the vacuum. We're no longer one great Christendom. So, I'm German. There was not a German country. Germany was not a country until really the 19th century. Or I'm French, or Italian. And so you had to create, well, okay, that's not quite enough. So what did you have to create along with the idea of nationalism, the idea of race? A totally unscientific concept. Totally made up concept. Okay. Now, so what do you have happening? Things seem to be progressing. And then you have the Dreyfus Affair, which I won't go into, but a distinguished captain in the French army is accused of espionage, which was totally untrue. And that unleashed a torrent of anti-Semitism in Europe and in France in particularly. Matter of fact, a lot of the iconology of Nazism and of the Nazi anti-Semitism in the 1930s is born out of imagery that they take from some of the Dreyfus, and they just remake it. Okay, and that happened in the Dreyfus affair went on for over a decade. He was eventually acquitted, but that didn't. Don't let the facts get in the way of a good idea. And then in 1881, there was the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. Okay, there was only one Jewish person that was marginally involved in the conspiracy, but the Tsar's Secret Service used that as an excuse to crack down. And the result is, first of all, these are things that appeared in French press in the late, I think the right hand where Dreyfus, here you have his face as the Hydra. Here it becomes more stereotypical Jewish, turning into the octopus, which will be a favorite Nazi propaganda. This is from Enlightenment France in 1905. And then you had the pogroms for about a 30-year period. This is a map. These red marks is a map where all of them they happened. Okay, the major ones. There was ones that didn't happen, but those were the major ones. Okay, which in some levels probably saved thousands of lives because they said we need to get out of here. So those who left, some of your ancestors maybe left during that period, saved the lives of their grandchildren, great-grandchildren. And part of the Tsar, there was a lot of things going on in Russia. We won't touch Russian history, but the Tsar's Secret Service wrote the Protocols of Zion, which to this day is a best-selling book in Egypt. There was a period of time, like 5 years ago, it was the #1 best-selling book in Egypt. After 9/11, it was reprinted in multiple editions in New York City, where people were buying it there. And it's basically, the story grows, but it starts out as that the Jewish financiers are the ones behind the destabilizing empires. That eventually turns into a myth about it was the Jews who started World War I. And you have the kind of merger of the fear of Marxism, okay, and Hitler and the Nazis will call it a Jewish philosophy, okay, and you have that merging with the conspiracy. So this is the originally great conspiracy theory. And frankly, there's almost direct lines to some of the current conspiracy theories to this book, all right, and to this idea that Jews are really ruling the world through the banks. So there were a couple of responses. You know the story of Herzl and the beginning of Zionism, and then massive immigration. We need to get out of the Russian Empire. Now, this is an interesting stuff because this is our story here as well, Jews in the American experiment. And in many ways, the first new promised land, right? America does. You may or not know, but the woman who wrote the poem on the Statue of Liberty is she was Sephardic Jew on one side and Polish Jew on the other side, Emma Lazarus. The chief financier for the Revolutionary War was a Jewish business person. Did you know that? Hyman Solomon, okay, who died broke because continental money wasn't worth anything to pay him back, okay? Of course, there's Judge Brandeis and a gravestone of a Jewish veteran from World War II. Now, one of the things, this is going back, but one of the interesting things about the American-Jewish relations is this idea of this Calvinist idea that the Puritans brought here, that this was the new promised land, and that these American Puritans were the new chosen people. Okay? We have elections. Why do we have elections? Because the elect are the ones who vote. Who are the elect? Originally, they were the members of the Puritan Church, the chosen ones. Elect, chosen, the new chosen people. Okay? And so this idea of even manifest destiny is a bastard of this. Can I say that here? Can I say that word here? Okay. It's too late. Too late. But at any rate, this idea that we're the new chosen embrace here, a new chosen place, and this identity that is a part of the Christian American consciousness it's part of the strange dynamic between American Christianity and American Judaism. And that's a whole subject of itself. This is the oldest standing synagogue in America. The Touro Synagogue in Newport. It was founded in 1658. The building was built in the 1750s. It's the new promised land. And it's just important because this is part of there are certain, I once had a rabbi say to me, I don't understand you Christians, okay? Because the ones who love me make me afraid, and the ones who I want to like don't seem to like me. Okay, so, and part of that, okay, is born out of, on the left you have this missions in the Middle East. There was a great movement in the late 18th century, but in the beginning of the 19th century, that for us to usher in the kingdom of God, we need to convert the world. And that includes Muslims and Jews. So we had all these wonderful, idealistic, ill-fated attempts to convert Jews and Muslims in the Middle East. What they ended up doing was converting a few lapsed Eastern Orthodox Christians to Protestantism, but they built schools and hospitals. All the American universities were started. It's the American University in Beirut, American University in Cairo, and Istanbul were all mission schools. So you have that on one side, okay? On the other side, this is for those of us who grew up in certain evangelical circles, we lived on these charts. This is the chart of how the world's going to end, including the return of Jesus Christ, the rapture, the millennium, all that talk, the left behind people. That movement starts in the 19th century. And Israel is really important in that framework because Jesus can't come back until Israel gets their land and builds a temple. So they're really pro-Israel. Sometimes not so sure about American Jews, but they're really pro-Israel. Okay? Okay? Whereas liberal Protestants have all kinds of relationships with Jews. We're on interfaith councils with each other. We're just really concerned about Israel. So you have it's a very difficult, interesting relationship, but it's born out of the 19th century. And so what are American responses to Jewish immigration? One is the Society of Christian Approach to the Jews. We're going to share Jesus with Jesus' family. Evangelism, conversion, attempted conversion to Jews. And then this is from 1895. It's from a magazine that no longer exists, but you can't necessarily see it, but it is Jews are coming from the east and driving us to the west. These Jewish immigrants have come to replace us. That idea was here in 1895. Okay, we heard that recently, or still here, right? All right, the 20th century. What I think particularly, I hear our group of German World War I soldiers celebrating Hanukkah up here, of course, right beside Auschwitz. This is two of the more interesting Jewish figures of the 20th century, you know. This is Ben Gurion as a young man in Palestine. Of course, this is the liberation up here of the Western Wall in 67, quite a century. 1919, he said this in 1919. The ultimate goal must definitely be the removal of Jews altogether. A young as an art student, he wrote an essay. Now, this is not going to be about the Holocaust. It's too much, and it's something probably you all know enough about. But the relationship of the Holocaust and Christianity. First of all, Nazism is a pagan ideology. It eventually went after Christians. As a matter of fact, there were Christians in the concentration camps before there were Jews. Okay, ministers who opposed them and such. Okay, but the 9th of November, the 9th day of the 11th month. Okay, it's not the Jewish calendar, but the Nazis chose it on purpose. The 9th day of Av, the same day of the destruction of the temples, and the expulsion of Jews from Spain. And so Nazism is not a Christian ideology. Would it have happened but it would not have happened without centuries of Christian anti-Semitism. And that's part of the strange thing about how anti-Judaism becomes anti-Semitism, is that you can almost say all Enlightenment philosophies are illegitimate stepchildren of Judaism and Christianity, but there was something that kept in the water, or kept in the genetic material, about the fear of otherness. And the one people who have been consistently marginalized by the people in power are the very people suspect because they're in the margins. And it's one of the, I think, one of the incredible, tragic, systemic issues of the last 2,100 years that hasn't changed. Matter of fact, I think there's some reasons to be as concerned now as other times. I just also want to say, okay, there were Christians who opposed Hitler. This is the White Rose Society, Bonhoeffer, Corrie ten Boom, the Jewish priest Knopf. All three of, only Corrie ten Boom is the only Christian who survived their opposition to Hitler. But the German Christians en masse went behind Hitler, and even there was a shadowy Christian or church, Hitler church, that many people belonged to. This is the Garden of the Righteous Among the Nations and the at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem. And this is where those Gentiles, the righteous Gentiles that opposed Nazism, are honored, okay? Which is a beautiful thing, okay? There were millions, tens and tens of millions of Christians in Europe during the Holocaust, okay? There are 2,000 trees. Okay. So again, I'm sure there were thousands of unsung people who sacrificed, right? But 2,000 out of 80 million? Jewish-Christian relations since the Shoah. And I think this is where we want to go after these sessions, so I'm not going to go in detail. Pope John Paul II asking for forgiveness at the Western Wall might be one of the most miraculous redemptive things that have happened in my lifetime. Of course, the partnership in the civil rights movement with Jews and on the forefront of the civil rights movement, often before Christians, something that a lot of African-Americans, young African-Americans, have no idea about. Yeah. This is just John Paul II saying how unacceptable the persecution, how unacceptable the history of anti-Semitism is. But I'll go back to today. We know that figure, right, from January 6th. You know, the anti-Semitism from the right, boycott, sanctioned investment against Israel, which doesn't have to become anti-Semitic. It almost always is. Doesn't have to be, okay? But I've spent a lot of the last 15 years dealing with this, and it's a very slippery slope there. And that's kind of representative of some of the tensions from the left. This was from 2018, from who now the Speaker of the House, but he was a representative then. We cannot allow Soros, Steyer, and Bloomberg to buy this election. Okay, that's about as loud as a dog whistle you can blow right there. The Anti-Defamation League for the last nearly 50 years has been doing a survey about anti-Jewish tropes across the population. Well, from 1964, for most of the last 50 years, it's been going down, okay? Not so much over the last 4 years, it's going back up. Where, and basically it measured, 20% of Americans surveyed had agreed with 6 anti-Semitic statements or more that are basically exactly that, right? Stereotypes about Jews. Okay. You know, we started out this idea, the medieval difference between the synagogue as being the blind woman with the church, but there's a lot happened over the last 80 years that says we can do better. And this is a statue on St. Joe's University campus. It is the synagogue and ecclesia sitting together and learning from each other. and that statue was dedicated as Nostra, the 50th anniversary of Vatican II, and really a radical statement that has opened up Catholic Christian or Catholic Jewish dialogue and other things. And this is Pope Francis dedicating and blessing the statue. So that's where I end. That's about as much hope as you get from me tonight, but it is a hopeful thing. So.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Scott, and for everyone for being here and being there. I want to say 3 historical notes in passing, and then I actually want to talk about this building in relation to the topic at hand. Napoleon is a fascinating individual when it comes to Jews. Napoleon was trying to invade the Holy Land, Israel. He got as far as Akko, and he's turned back. But his dream was to create some kind of Jewish entity, possibly even rebuild the temple. And so Napoleon and the Jews is a fascinating topic that's certainly worth looking at some more. When you talked about nationalism as this recent construct, it made me think about, 2 of the great, if you will, celebrations of nationalism in our lives are the World Cup and the Olympics, right? Olympics begins in like 1896 and the World Cup in like 1932. These are very modern constructs, and we often think about nationalism and nations as very, very ancient, and they are to some degree, but not the way that we understand them today. And I think understanding how new the World Cup and the Olympics are in terms of the celebration of nationalism is a reference point. There's a very, very interesting 10-minute movie that Frank Sinatra made in 1945 called The House I Live In that you may want to look at. It's a little bit dated, one could say, for some of the language, but Frank Sinatra in 1945 does this 10-minute little movie that's, I assume, shown at movie theaters before movies, the main feature is shown. And it's Frank Sinatra, he's in the middle of recording a song, and he goes out for a smoke, and there's a bunch of kids picking on a Jewish kid. And he has this amazing dialogue with these kids to show them how un-American they are by picking on this young Jewish kid. It won a special Academy Award and it won a special Golden Globe after its release. So it's just 10 minutes, and I highly recommend taking a look at it when you have a chance. But it marks that shift post-Shoah until perhaps recently it was uncool to be anti-Jewish. And that the force and the magnitude of the Shoah is lessening. And unfortunately, as that lessens, those old voices are creeping up again. Okay, this building. Many of you may remember Sue Tenner of blessed memory, a wonderful potter in town, architect. She designed this building. And the facade in the front, so when you leave, take a look at the facade. And she explained to me one day why she built it that way. Some of you may remember I think it was 1978, there was a 3-part made-for-TV series called Holocaust. Meryl Streep was in it. It was this all-star cast. And it was kind of one of the first public tellings that we actually had in the United States about the Holocaust. And it's really kind of a turning point. The show begins by a classic Eastern European wooden synagogue on fire. The facade of that burning synagogue that represents the Shoah and the destruction of the Jews is what Sue Tenner used for the facade of our synagogue here. She designed it as a statement that we overcame, and we are still here, and we are still alive, despite that anti-Semitism. The second thing about this synagogue, over there, if you take a look, there's 2 stained glass windows. You're going to see on the wall over there with the Jewish star and some, if those you can't see in the front, but as you leave, you can see on the wall over here. They're from a synagogue, I believe it's in Brooklyn. It was a synagogue that wasn't being used. It was falling apart, and the local kids, you got stones, you got colored glass, not for anti-Semitic reasons at all. There was colored glass, and let's see if we can break those windows. There was a non-Jewish family that lived in that neighborhood, and they thought that was terrible. And so they took those windows. That family eventually moves to Vermont. And when they heard that we were building the synagogue here in the mid-1980s, they decided to donate those windows to the Israel congregation. And it's just a wonderful example of the many unsung moments where people of different religions care about each other and take care of each other. And we always, always need to remember those stories and amplify them. Thank you.
Carol Goldsmith says, though from a much earlier time were the writings of Peter Abelard revived during the Enlightenment, or were they ever revived?
Well, it's been a while since I got a Peter Abelard question. Because he was kind of a questioning guy, there was his ideas were revived. Not necessarily all good for Judaism. Peter Abelard did have kind of a resurgence as someone who kind of questioned authority. So he was seen as kind of a proto-Enlightenment figure in certain circles. I don't know if that's your question, but that's the best answer I have on Abelard right now for you, okay? Yeah.
One other thing there about Sinatra.
Frank Sinatra was a major funder of Temple Isaiah in Palm Springs in 1972.
Oh, okay.
There we go. Yeah, and you and I were talking about it was not necessarily, it wasn't popular as a Hollywood entertainer to be against anti-Semitism in 1944, whenever that film was done. Okay. Other questions or comments?
Frank Sinatra was a bag man also.
Yeah, well,
He funds for the army of Palestine, Israel. He delivered the money, and he was a bag man.
Yeah.
That's because of his own Zionist.
That's interesting, yeah.
I have a question though. I meant to ask this last time. Where does the hatred come from? You know, you could talk about, yes, we think that Jews rule the world monetarily. We think they rule the world education. There's so many different things that you can point to. But it had to start somewhere thousands of years ago.
Well, okay, so and I'm repeating for people online, the question is, where did the hate come from? Well, it's a part of what kind of tried to sketch here, right? I mean, there are all kinds of seeds. How does a disagreement, what's the difference between a disagreement being, okay, you have your position, I have my position, all right, I'll buy the drinks tonight, let's go have a drink, right? Or till turns into a war or a hate, right? And I think part of, that's part of what this survey's tried to at least describe. And I think it's, I think what becomes rival ideas, which is a legitimate theological debate, which I actually still think, for me, good interfaith dialogue is not the least common denominator, but bringing our full wealth of convictions together, right? But what started out as, the same faith with a very different interpretation about who Jesus was, became competitive, and then became a significant other. And some of it may be the even existence of Judaism what called into question the truth of Christianity. That's maybe one way to interpret it. That's kind of maybe the way Rosemary Ruther kind of goes in some of her ideas. So it could be the other who opposes me brings something out in me. I mentioned Rene Girard has a whole other different take. Why do we have envy? Why do we scapegoat? Okay, I think just like psychologically we project our problems on other people. We project, some of what's going on with us on other people. I think there's a dynamic about that with peoples, and particularly folks who are different from us, people who are vulnerable. I mean, in some levels, the vulnerability of Judaism, I think, brings out some of that. Also, the sense from the Christian story, you're still the chosen ones. I mean, there's always been theologies that say we've replaced them, but there's still this sense, all right, that there's still this kind of chosenness, which I think, for instance, Voltaire doesn't like Christianity, but his strongest language of hate is for Judaism. You don't have to, Marx comes before Freud, But what is Marx's hatred of Judaism? I think Freud would have some ideas what that's about, right? So I think it's an interesting question. I think it's always, those which are other are always open to being everything from scapegoated to hated.
Let me just add to that if you go into the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, you have repeated more than any other statement is to love the stranger, to protect the stranger, why is that? In that ancient text, why is that in there? Well, obviously, the other people were othered even way back when. It's a long-standing, terrible human problem.
Yeah, and Jesus, being the good Jew that he was, goes on to say that, when you welcome the other, you welcomed me. Yeah. So, yeah.
Could you please tell me what is the difference between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism?
I think anti-Judaism is about a religious idea. Okay? So anti-Judaism began actually as, it's taken from names of disputations. There were public debates between Jews and Christians. Okay? And so against the Jews, these things would be written. So it's debate on, is your interpretation right about who God is, or is my interpretation right about who God is? So it's a religious question, okay, a theological question. Anti-Semitism is a hatred of a people. Okay, it's not that I disagree. It's not that I disagree with your ideas. I question your right to exist. That's the difference. Yeah.
May I just ask, wasn't that on the invitation of the church? Again, because there were discussions about it and open in Europe in the Middle Ages and in the early Renaissance.
Yeah, absolutely. Christians did it. It was against the official policy of the church to do it. It was always against the official policy of the church. Matter of fact, during the First Crusade, when 500,000 Jews were killed in the Rhineland, one of the cardinals actually sent his army troops out to defend the Jews of his town and attack the Crusaders. But again, no, absolutely, it was, and particularly around superstitious projects, like the idea of they are God killers, the idea that they're killing Christian children, the whole blood libel thing. So what was happening, what the official policy versus the practices, and then there's plenty of anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism that was anti-Semitic as well in official Christianity as well. Yeah. But it was always, there were constraints, there were theological constraints on it in Christendom that went away in modernity. That's kind of the irony of the displacement of Christianity and the replacement with Enlightenment and the nation state. There's no, again, I'm not defending what Christianity did in its history. I think it's a shameful history. But ironically, the marginalization of Christianity in part helped set up the 20th century. Both, and how Jews suffered in the Soviet Union, it's a whole other thing, right? But thank you, no, appreciate, yes.
I wasn't at the last one, but I was curious if there was any discussion or mention of Shakespeare, The Merchant of Venice.
Oh. Yeah, right. Well, that's a great example of, I mean,
Why don't you repeat the question?
Okay, did I mention the Merchant of Venice? No, I didn't, but boy, you just did, right? And it's just one of so many examples that we can find in that, yeah. Pardon?
I said it can be interpreted because he said, don't I bleed?
Oh, right, no, yeah, that's right. That's right, that is right, that's the, yeah. It's a stereotype, but is he also tweaking it, right? Is he also, yeah.
So you really can interpret it any which way.
Right, that's a good point, very good point.
This is somewhat tangential, but it's something that is meaningful to me to want to mention. During the Holocaust, there was one country whose Jewish population at the beginning of the war was, at the end of the war, was about 8 or 9 times the size that it was at the beginning of the war. You know, most countries, the Netherlands, for example, 85–90% of the Jews were slaughtered. France, they were so complicit in surrounding the Jews. Lithuania, the Ukraine, all these countries were enormously complicit with the Nazis. When they say the Nazis killed, it was mostly the local people who aided and helped the Nazis. And then they would go to church the next day on Sunday. One country, though, had a small Jewish population, about 200. And at the end of the war, they had about 1,600 to 1,800 because they protected their Jews, and those seeking refuge, they protected them too. And that country was Albania.
Right.
And Albania is the only Muslim majority country in Europe.
Right.
And the Albanians, there's a book called Besa, pictures of 80 either people who saved Jews or their children or people who knew, and they all say, why do we save the Jews? Because that's what Islam teaches us.
Right.
If somebody comes to you for refuge, you take care of them. And there's an Albanian concept called Besa. When somebody comes to you and they're in danger, you save them. And so it's ironic that, you know, I know the Mufti of Jerusalem was an ally of Hitler, an Arab who wanted to kill all the Jews and set up concentration camps. But the only Muslim majority country in Europe had the best record of saving, protecting Jews. And I think it's important to know in this day and age.
No, I think that's really important. And those of you in mind, it's talking about the only country in Europe that increased the number of Jews during World War II was Albania, and it was predominantly a Muslim country. Also, the Muslims of North Africa, many places, they were protected their Jewish population as well. You know, one comment here online, when we were talking about what are the different motivations, why it happens, some with blood libel, envy, you need someone below you, is also the basis of racism, right? So we see racism, there's a certain kind of construct that, you know, that repeats itself. But the history in the West, not I would say West, but in, you know, East as well, Christianity and well, and the Muslim, it depends what the Caliph was, right? You know, during the Muslim period. But yeah, it is the Jewish people have been targeted ever since the destruction of Jerusalem or of the Southern Kingdom in 587, right? They've been a vulnerable people ever since then. You have been that.
So a final story for the evening. So why am I here? So when the Cossacks came to Ternivka in either the end of the 19th century or beginning of the 20th century, the neighbors of my great-grandparents circled their house with pictures of Christian icons, and that saved my family, and I'm now here.
Thank you so much, Bill, Michael, and everyone who attended, and everyone who was online. Really, it's really important what we're doing, getting together and having these, and we envision many more of these types of events, and we will put the word out and welcome you all. Just like in every good Jewish and Christian event, it's followed by refreshments. So please join us next door for some refreshments and ask some more questions and just enjoy each other's company. And to me, you know, obviously the last sign of hope here, and this is also a sign of hope. Thank you.